The art of winning alone is not about strength. It is about removing the need for witnesses. That's a concept we often try not to think about too deeply. When someone achieves success without support, without help from others, it makes people uneasy. We say we admire people who are independent. We share stories of entrepreneurs who started with nothing, unique geniuses, people who changed the system. Yet in places like offices, meeting rooms, or teams, someone who doesn't need others is often viewed with suspicion. They are watched closely. Back in the 1950s, Solomon Asch performed an interesting experiment. He asked people to compare the length of lines, a task that was very simple. What he found was when people working with the experimenter intentionally chose the wrong answer, many of the participants also chose the wrong answer at least once. They went against what they saw to fit in with the group. The usual way to explain this is that people feel pressure from others. But there's more to it. Going along with the group isn't just about being afraid of being wrong. It shows you're safe, you belong, and you won't cause trouble. If someone consistently refuses to agree with the group, they're not just disagreeing about the lines. They're showing they don't need the group's approval. And that can be a problem because our instincts tell us to be wary of those who go it alone. In early societies, staying alive depended on working together. If someone separated themselves from the group's way of doing things, it caused concern. Experts in how the human mind works, like Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, believe we're wired to notice people who cheat or take advantage of others. But our minds may not differentiate between a cheater and someone who is simply very independent. Both act outside normal rules of give and take. This idea translates into the real world. I've seen workers who do very well in their jobs become isolated after achieving personal success. At a technology company that I studied, a senior engineer finished a product earlier than expected, mostly on his own. He was praised and received bonuses. After that, he gradually stopped being included in group projects and early planning meetings. Nobody said anything directly, but he was left out. When I inquired with a coworker why, the response was telling. He doesn't need us. That statement reveals a key idea about strategy that most advice books miss. Feeling like you belong comes from needing each other. When that need disappears, so does the feeling of safety. The group can no longer influence you or predict what you'll do, and that uncertainty is viewed as a threat. We often admire the idea of someone who works alone, but actual wolves live in packs. A lone wolf is often hurt or dying. The idea of the lone wolf is appealing because it seems to celebrate personal success. It hides the downsides. Even movies and TV shows reveal our discomfort. The genius who works alone is either morally questionable or has trouble connecting with others. Think of Sherlock Holmes, Michael Corleone, or the hacker who is successful but can't form relationships. We don't often tell stories about well-adjusted people who are successful without allies. I didn't realize how common this pattern was until I began to look for it. Independence in stories is almost always paired with some kind of emotional problem, as if we feel the need to make up for the threat it poses. Psychologists tend to explain the group's distrust of independent people as envy. I don't think that's the whole story. Envy exists, but it doesn't explain the subtle suspicion that can attach to someone who succeeds alone. When someone rises to the top without help, people start to look for hidden tricks. Who did he hurt to get there? What did she do to manipulate people? This happens even if there's no evidence. Why? Because our sense of what's right and wrong is based on exchange. Studies by researchers like Ernst Fair show that people will punish what they see as unfair advantages, even if it costs them something personally. In experiments, people often give up money to punish someone who is gaining more than they should. It's not just about inequality, it's about breaking the rules of expected reciprocity. Someone who succeeds alone seems to break this rule. They benefit without giving credit to others. They rise without sharing the burden. Whether this view is correct isn't the point. The group already sees this pattern and registers it as something that could cause instability. I remember talking to a manager who was quickly promoted after making changes to his department. His changes improved how things worked. Yet, people started making cutting jokes about him. Words like political and calculating began to surface. There was no scandal, no proof of wrongdoing, just speed. He had moved up faster than people could accept. Here's where the theory starts to break down. We're told that if you're good at your job, you'll earn respect. That's true in controlled situations. In real life, being skilled and independent can appear like you're trying to dominate, and dominance without loyalty makes others feel defensive. Belonging operates as if everyone is on the same level. Dominance is a vertical structure. The person who succeeds alone is moving out of the horizontal plane, and that shift is rarely forgotten quickly. There's another element that people rarely talk about. When someone succeeds through working with others, responsibility is diffused. If things go wrong, blame can be shared. But when someone succeeds alone, they are fully accountable. This makes others uncomfortable. It suggests that power can be consolidated, and people remember what can happen when power becomes too centralized. I've seen teams pressure high performers to be more collaborative, even when it slows things down. It's presented as team building, but it's really about keeping everyone on the same level. The goal is to make the independent person more dependent, to bring them back into the group, and to reduce the imbalance. There's an uncomfortable contradiction here. We say we value independence, but our systems reward those who work well with others. Performance reviews often include measures of team contribution, not just to encourage cooperation, but to limit individual power. This is rarely said out loud. From the group's point of view, it makes sense. Stability requires being able to predict what will happen. But from a strategic perspective, it reveals something colder. The moment you no longer need the group starts thinking about how to manage you. This is when admiration becomes surveillance. I was surprised by how strong this reaction can be. People describe high performers who work alone as intense, hard to read, and not one of us. These are social judgments, not job evaluations. They're attempts to reclassify dominance as something that's not normal. Yet, the person who succeeds alone often feels a sense of clarity. There are fewer compromises, decisions are cleaner, and it's easier to stay focused. That can be intoxicating. It's easy to see the group's discomfort as jealousy or weakness. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's an instinctual alarm ringing through modern structures. So, we're left with a tension that we rarely discuss. Belonging requires showing that you need others. Dominance means not being tied to others. You can prioritize one, but not both completely. The troubling question isn't whether we distrust those who succeed alone. We do. The more dangerous question is what happens when someone understands this instinct and learns to use both admiration and fear of isolation at the same time. If admiration turns into surveillance the moment you no longer need the group, then needing others becomes more than just seeking comfort. It becomes a strategic weakness. Machiavelli understood this long before modern psychology. In The Prince, written in the early 16th century, he kept coming back to one idea. Using outside forces is dangerous. Hired soldiers can't be trusted, and allies are only useful until their goals change. He used military language, but the idea is about psychology. When you depend on someone else for your safety, you give them power over you. Take Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli's most admired person. In the early 1500s, Borgia gained power in Romagna not by trusting local leaders, but by putting his own governor, Ramiro de Orco, in charge to enforce strict order. Once things were stable, Borgia publicly killed him and displayed his body in the town square. Experts debate the theatricality, but the message was clear. Order didn't belong to the governor. It belonged to Borgia. He used dependence and then ended it decisively. I used to think this was just something cruel from the Renaissance period. Then I started seeing a softer version in the business world. In 2011, Steve Jobs was gone, but the story of his removal from Apple in the 1980s is still taught in business schools. He brought in John Sculley from Pepsi, creating what seemed like a strong partnership. Within a few years, Sculley led the effort to push Jobs out. Officially, it was about different management styles. Underneath, it was about shifting power. Jobs had created an ally who became strong enough to challenge his authority. Dependence had created a rival. There's data to support this idea. Studies of CEOs in large companies in the late 20th and early 21st centuries show that many are dismissed not because of outside pressure, but by internal boards. In other words, leaders are often removed by those who are supposed to be their partners. The alliance meant to provide stability becomes the way they are removed. This is where the sense of security starts to break down. In social psychology, we talk about attachment as safety. John Bowlby's attachment theory says that secure relationships are fundamental to healthy growth. In close relationships, that's true. But in competitive settings, attachment creates imbalance. If I need you to keep my position, you could demand things from me. You could delay things. You can threaten to leave. The more publicly I depend on you, the less freedom I have to act. Game theory models this well. In repeated prisoner's dilemma experiments, cooperation happens when both sides expect to interact in the future. But that expectation also creates vulnerability. Robert Axelrod's experiments in the 1980s showed that cooperative strategies like tit for tat work well in stable environments. Yet if one player has more to lose from not cooperating, power shifts. The more invested you are in the relationship, the weaker your position becomes. This idea is rarely stated directly in offices. Instead, we hear softer terms: alignment, synergy, cross-functional collaboration. I've watched founders bring in co-founders to balance their weaknesses, only to find themselves gradually outvoted. In 2014, a well-known ride-sharing company experienced a boardroom conflict that led to the founder's resignation. Publicly, it was called governance reform. Privately, it was a story about investors gaining control once the company no longer depended solely on its original creator. From the inside, this doesn't feel like someone is betraying you. It feels like procedure, and that's what makes it so effective. Subordinates sense it too. When a manager relies heavily on one loyal person, others adjust. They send information through that person. They form other groups. The favored ally becomes both a shield and a bottleneck. I've heard people describe this dynamic with surprising clarity. If you want to survive, you don't just report to the boss. You watch who the boss needs. That statement stayed with me. Power isn't about who supports you. It's about how many people you can afford to lose. Machiavelli specifically warned against relying on hired soldiers because they fight for money, not loyalty. In modern terms, that means contractors, consultants, even charismatic executives brought in to stabilize a department. They have their own reasons for doing things. They can leave with little cost. But even loyal insiders aren't immune. Loyalty is often a two-way street until it's not. Reasons change, boards change, political winds shift. Here, psychology says that cooperative systems can be stabilized through rules and transparency. And that's true in certain situations. But Machiavelli's view is colder. Rules reduce problems, but they don't eliminate ambition. I didn't expect how consistently this plays out in battles to take over a company. When a leader trains a successor, They believe they're ensuring smooth transition. In reality, they're creating someone with legitimacy and access. The successor gains information, relationships, and authority. Once ready, that structure can operate on its own. The helpful alliance becomes a parallel power base. Dependence feels like insurance. In reality, it's collateral. Even on a personal level, this dynamic is apparent. Consider a high performer who relies entirely on one person within a company. That person supports, protects, and promotes them. The security is intoxicating. Then that person leaves. Suddenly, the high performer realizes that their network was focused in one direction. Without that single connection, their influence collapses. I've seen careers stall not because of not being good at the job, but because too many relationships were built around one person. Security and vulnerability aren't opposites. They're often the same thing viewed from different perspectives. Machiavelli's advice to leaders wasn't to avoid alliances altogether. It was to avoid being defined by them, to ensure that support flowed toward you, not the other way around. Psychologically, that means reducing situations where your existence depends on someone else's continued goodwill. This sounds harsh when stated plainly. It also sounds paranoid. I hesitated when I first understood it this way, but the pattern happens too often to ignore. Every alliance has an embedded risk. The moment your partner realizes you need them more than they need you, the balance shifts. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most people enter alliances seeking safety, not power. They want relief from uncertainty. They want shared responsibility. They want others to witness their struggle. That desire is human. It's also exploitable. If dependence creates points of leverage, then the next question isn't whether alliances are dangerous. It's how subtle that danger can become, and how quietly someone can cultivate your reliance before you realize the cost. If someone can quietly cultivate your reliance before you realize the cost, the next step is even more unsettling. They can control not only your dependence, but your emotional state. And fear, when used carefully, becomes valuable. Machiavelli's line is so famous, it's become a cliche. It's better to be feared than loved if you can't be both. The moral outrage it causes usually ends the discussion. Fear means cruelty. Love means legitimacy. End of story. But when I started looking at the psychology behind that statement, the simplicity disappeared. Fear isn't just an emotion. It's a system that prioritizes neurological responses. In the early 2000s, neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux mapped brain pathways that allow the amygdala to respond to threat before the prefrontal cortex fully processes information. The low road bypasses thinking. When uncertainty signals danger, attention narrows, reaction time increases, and memories become stronger. Biologically, fear reorganizes thinking around staying alive. Love doesn't do that. Affection relaxes alertness. It broadens thinking, as Barbara Fredrickson's research shows. People become more creative and more exploratory. That's great for new ideas. It's less reliable for immediate compliance. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in 1961 are still unsettling. Participants, instructed by an authority figure, administered what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person. Most continued to the highest voltage level. The standard explanation highlights the power of authority. But watch the footage closely. Participants aren't sadistic. They're anxious. They look at the experimenter repeatedly, seeking cues. The tension is high. Authority plus controlled anxiety produces obedience. This is where theory shifts from morality to how things work. In organizational research, Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety shows that teams perform better when people feel safe to speak up. That finding is often celebrated. Yet, the same research shows something else. In low psychological safety environments, people report fewer errors, disagree less, and comply more in the short term. Performance can improve, especially in execution-driven industries. I've seen this inside sales organizations. A regional director publicly praises top performers but changes territories without warning. No one knows when the next reallocation will come. Officially, it's about improving the market. Unofficially, it keeps everyone slightly off balance. People answer emails faster, avoid pushing back, and monitor the director's moods. Revenue increases for a time. The cost is chronic stress, which surfaces later as burnout and employees leaving. Fear here isn't about shouting or humiliation. It's about unpredictable actions. Political rhetoric offers an even clearer example. In the years following major terrorist attacks, approval ratings for incumbent leaders often surged. Political scientists have documented the rally around the flag effect. External threat increases support for centralized authority. Speeches during such times consistently emphasize vulnerability, urgency, and high stakes. The population's amygdala is activated on a wide scale. Calls for expanded surveillance or military action meet less resistance. The leader doesn't need to terrorize personally. They need to present the environment as unstable and position themselves as the one who can stabilize it. This is the fear economy. Anxiety circulates, and authority converts it into compliance. I didn't expect how subtle the balance can be. Too much fear and resistance builds. Research shows that extreme repression often generates underground networks and eventual revolt. But moderate, intermittent uncertainty keeps people calculating individually rather than coordinating collectively. Each person focuses on personal survival. Inside companies, this is seen in performance management systems that are opaque by design. Criteria shift. Promotions seem partly based on merit, partly mysterious. People spend time trying to understand signals instead of challenging structure. Love-based leadership relies on loyalty. It feels warmer. It's also fragile. Once affection erodes, authority collapses quickly. Machiavelli's point wasn't that cruelty is effective. It was that fear is more stable than love because it doesn't depend on voluntary reciprocity. Love requires continuous reinforcement. It can evaporate with disappointment. Fear persists as long as uncertainty persists. Yet, modern leadership says otherwise. Modern leadership frameworks emphasize inspiration, empathy, and servant leadership. And many of those improve long-term culture. But they often underestimate a reality I've observed. Even the most admired leaders maintain a limit, a sense that crossing certain lines carries consequences. Employees feel it in their reactions, the slight hesitation before presenting bad news, the careful wording in emails, the pause before disagreeing. These small reactions aren't caused by hate. They're responses to perceived stakes. The question becomes more uncomfortable when we think about our own reactions. Think about the manager who is universally liked but rarely taken seriously. Deadlines slip, rules bend. Compare that with the manager who is respected, slightly distant, whose displeasure is unpredictable but not explosive. Which one shapes behavior more reliably? Theory provides an incomplete answer. It says to balance both, be warm and firm. That sounds reasonable, but in times of crisis, leaders instinctively increase uncertainty. They hold back information, centralize decisions, and narrow communication channels. Anxiety rises, and with it, compliance. This isn't an argument for brutality, it's an understanding of the mechanisms. It works whether we agree with it or not. Fear reorganizes attention, simplifies choice, and reduces disagreement. The deeper contradiction is people often say they love leaders who make them feel safe. Yet, They adjust their behavior most quickly around leaders who make them feel unsure. If controlled anxiety is a tool, then the real question isn't whether fear works. It's how much can be introduced before it stops being effective and causes things to fall apart. If controlled anxiety is valuable, then distance is the vault that stores it. Fear doesn't require shouting, it requires asymmetry. And one of the easiest ways to create asymmetry is to become slightly unreachable. There's psychology research that doesn't get used in strategy. In 2003, Adam Galinsky and others showed that people who felt influential perceived others as physically closer, while those who felt powerless perceived greater distance. Power changes spatial perception. It reorganizes how near or far others feel. That sounds abstract until you notice how many leaders instinctively increase physical and informational distance once they move up a corner office, restricted schedules, assistants, and private entrances. These aren't just symbols of status, they're ways to manage perception. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram conducted another study beyond obedience. He examined what he called the small world problem, showing that social networks are surprisingly interconnected. Later research confirmed that influence spreads through short connections. If access is easy, authority is diffused. If access is restricted, the value concentrates. Scarcity increases perceived worth. Robert Cialdini formalized this in the 1980s, but elite circles practiced it way before it was named. Venture capital firms limit availability, and founders compete for slots, and the meetings becomes a reward. The investor's isolation amplified perceived authority before a single word about strategy was exchanged. This is rarely called manipulation because it hides behind busyness. Political leadership offers a compelling case study. Early in his time as president, Vladimir Putin cultivated this aura through carefully managed public appearances and communication. Access to him became limited. Remember those long tables separating him from visitors? That wasn't just about health concerns. Analysts debated the symbolism, but the underlying effect was his calculated unpredictability. When a leader isn't readily accessible, speculation starts, leading to projection, then the birth of myth. This plays out in corporate life too. A CEO who holds weekly town halls, answers questions candidly, and shares personal stories creates a sense of connection with employees, fostering psychological safety. The downside? Authority might seem weaker. Decisions could become open to discussion, even if only in tone. Now contrast this with leaders who communicate infrequently, using formal methods at set times. Their words carry weight because they are rare. Employees adapt quickly to this dynamic. I observed a newly appointed executive in a global company reduce casual interactions and focus communication on quarterly meetings. Soon, employees started treating snippets from these broadcasts like commands. The message was often ordinary, but its infrequency gave it strategic importance. Studies on social structures give us hints. They show individuals accept hierarchies easier when they perceive the structure as legitimate and stable. Legitimacy grows when lines are clearly drawn. Unclear lines cause challenges. A leader who is too friendly risks blurring those lines. The situation gets tricky here. Being accessible builds trust, while distance can build mystique. What approach leads to sustained control? Maybe variability is the key. Leaders who are never seen become irrelevant. Those who are always around become ordinary. The trick is to strike a balance. Enough visibility to show authority, but enough distance to keep familiarity from lessening status. For the employee, this is not abstract. It feels like waiting for approval, feedback, or a meeting that may or may not happen. The delay itself becomes a signal. If the leader responds instantly, the request feels less important. A response after a period of silence, even a brief one, feels weighty. Elite social circles operate on a similar principle. Think of private clubs, exclusive conferences, and closed groups. Limited access isn't about privacy alone, it's a signal. Members feel privileged because entry is restricted. The organizer doesn't have to say they are in charge. The system does it quietly. Machiavelli advised rulers to avoid being hated. Overfamiliarity breeds contempt when it shows weakness, but he warned against being hated as complete isolation can backfire. The trick is controlled distance, enough to avoid overexposure, but not so much that people get resentful. I've seen managers try to copy this by suddenly withdrawing, thinking distance equals authority. It usually fails. Without established legitimacy, isolation comes across as insecurity. This works only when the leader already has resources that others need. Distance strengthens existing power. It can't create it out of nothing. This is the unspoken part. Real influence isn't about being alone. It's about controlling access. It means making closeness to you feel earned, not automatic. This shapes how others perceive their position relative to you. We have a problem here. The more distant a leader becomes, the more information has to pass through others. These go-betweens gain influence, and filters distort the message. Isolation protects authority, but narrows the view. Here's the catch. If you pull back to keep your image, you need to stay informed to maintain control. At what point does distance become a hindrance instead of a tool? If distance makes you blind, something must compensate. Because once you lose sight of things, decisions become harsh, and those decisions need a justification. That's where internal negotiation comes in. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance from the 1950s starts with a simple conflict. When our actions clash with our self-image, we try to reduce the discomfort. In one experiment, people did a boring task and then were paid either $1 or $20 to tell the next person it was fun. The ones paid $1 rated the task as more interesting than those paid $20. Smaller reward, so more internal conflict, so belief changes to protect integrity. I used to see this as just a lab result, but then I saw it in power structures. When a leader makes a decision that hurts a group, layoffs, oppression, deception, there are two options: admit you're wrong and hurt your image, or twist the action into something necessary. Almost always, they pick the second option. During the 2008 financial crisis, executives at big banks called risky practices essential for competition. Later, internal emails showed they knew the system was fragile. But in public, they stuck to the story. No one saw the collapse coming. Aggressive moves were needed to survive. It was cognitive dissonance on a grand scale. They didn't see themselves as reckless, but as rational in a tough world. Behavioral economist Dan Ariely did experiments where people could cheat a little for small gains. When the cheating was minor and unclear, most people did it, just enough to benefit while keeping their self-image intact. They adjusted the story. Everyone does it. It's not really harmful, or the system is unfair anyway. That's the engine of rationalization. It doesn't require evil intentions, just small adjustments. Moral licensing adds another layer. In 2010, Benoit Monin and Dale Miller showed that people who had shown fairness were more likely to show bias later, feeling licensed by their past actions. This can be dangerous for leaders. A leader who makes a public ethical decision builds up moral credit, making it easier to justify harsher actions later. I've proven I'm good. I saw this during corporate changes. A CEO champions diversity, gains a good reputation, then quietly approves cost-cutting that hurts lower-level staff. In private, they say if we don't cut now, the whole company suffers. The story protects them. The self-image stays clean. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most cold strategists don't see themselves as cold. They see themselves as doing what's needed. Political history offers better examples. In the early 20th century, leaders who took power often called censorship and surveillance temporary safeguards. The words were protective, stability, unity, survival. Hannah Arendt noted that those working in totalitarian systems often saw themselves as managing order, not causing harm. The banality of evil wasn't about being evil. It was about normal people aligning their actions with a story of duty. This rarely announces itself. It whispers. Inside organizations, subordinates feel it first. A manager who once wanted open debate starts shutting down dissent, saying we don't have time to talk forever. The team sees the change and anxiety rises. When asked, the manager blames pressure from above, market changes, or shareholder demands. It's about necessity. The team might disagree, but the logic is coherent enough to reduce resistance. That's where the optimism of psychology fails. We teach ethics, codes of conduct, and compliance. But cognitive dissonance works below the surface. The more a leader sees themselves as ethical, the more creative they become in finding reasons for difficult choices. I didn't expect how quickly things could change. Small exceptions add up. A tampered number here, a hidden fact there, each justified by the context. Behavioral science shows people discount future moral costs compared to immediate gains. This applies to integrity, not just money. Then there's social reinforcement. When a leader makes a controversial move and advisors support it, the group becomes closer. Irving Janis wrote about groupthink in the 1970s, showing how groups stifle disagreement to stay united. Doubts are seen as weakness. Loyalty means agreement. Outsiders might call these people ruthless. Insiders see it differently. It feels like a burden, like carrying a responsibility that others don't understand. I've heard executives say, almost defensively, you can't run a company by being naive. The word naive is telling. It means morality without calculation is childish. Machiavelli saw this coming. He argued that a ruler must learn how to not be good and use that knowledge when needed. That shocks people today. But psychologically, it means be prepared to go against your own values if survival demands it. The danger isn't the act itself. It's the internal story that makes it seem normal. Because once you believe you are holding things together in a chaotic world, you can justify almost anything as preservation. The rationalization engine works well. It protects self-image, stabilizes authority, and silences doubt. But it also blurs the line between what's needed and what's simply convenient. And here the tension increases. If fear controls others, and distance creates mystique, and rationalization protects the self, what stops the system from turning into something its creator would have hated? If rationalization protects the designer, then the next step in power doesn't need constant moral negotiation. It needs design. Once you start shaping the environment, instead of reacting inside it, control stops looking like force and starts looking like it was meant to be. Game theory highlights this. In The Prisoner's Dilemma, two players acting selfishly end up worse off than if they cooperated. But change the rules slightly, adjust incentives, change how often it's played, create imbalances, and behavior changes predictably. The players think they are choosing freely, but actually, they're navigating a structure designed to guide their choices. Thomas Schelling, writing in the 1960s, showed how simple rules can create stable situations without anyone forcing it. If you want segregation in a city, you don't need racist laws. Individual preferences, added up across the system, create sharply divided neighborhoods. The structure does the work. No one seems tyrannical, yet the result is inflexible. That's where Machiavellian control becomes less about theatrics and more about the system. Consider corporate incentives. In the 1990s, many firms tied executive pay to quarterly earnings. The stated goal was to align with shareholder value. The result was predictable short-term thinking. Research showed higher earnings manipulation, stock buybacks, and cost-cutting at the expense of long-term investment. No one had to order manipulation. The incentives made it rational. I've been in meetings where managers said they valued employee well-being, then approved bonus systems that only rewarded output. Within months, corners were cut, burnout rose, and the managers expressed surprise. "I didn't expect that intensity," one of them said, but the system had already spoken. Governments work similarly. In the early 20th century, systems grew under the banner of efficiency. Max Weber described rational legal authority as impersonal and rule-bound. The promise was fairness. The result was that power became embedded in procedure. Decisions could be justified as regulation, not personal will. Responsibility disappeared into paperwork. Historical power grabs often follow this pattern. After the Reichstag fire in 1933, emergency orders in Germany legally expanded executive power. It didn't look like a sudden takeover. It was framed as procedure to address a crisis. By the time repression increased, the legal framework had already narrowed options. This happens in softer forms today. Digital platforms are the clearest example. Social media algorithms optimize for engagement. The goal is user satisfaction and ad revenue. But the system favors emotionally charged content, especially outrage and fear. Studies showed that posts triggering strong feelings spread more quickly. The algorithm doesn't tell users to be hateful or polarized. It nudges visibility based on metrics. Gradually, conversation changes. The engineers may not want division, but the system rewards it. From a user's perspective, it feels natural. You open an app, scroll, and react. You think you're exercising choice. Behind the screen, models adjust your feed based on past behavior. The system learns your triggers. It doesn't force you, it predicts you. That's a different kind of power. Direct force is obvious and invites resistance. Structural inevitability feels neutral. In economics, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein wrote about nudging, arguing that small changes can influence decisions without limiting freedom. Arrange healthy food at eye level, and cafeteria choices improve. The idea sounds good, but scale it up. Apply it to taxes, surveillance, digital identity. The system becomes policy. Inside companies, promotion works this way. If advancement depends on metrics, employees optimize for metrics. If personal connections matter more, they optimize for closeness. I've seen analysts shift from critique to being agreeable once they realized that disagreement slowed their careers. No one told them to soften their approach. The system taught them. That's where power stops being personal. The leader who designs the system can step back. Outcomes happen based on the built-in incentives. Subordinates manage themselves because going against the grain carries a predictable cost. Here, ethical guidelines start to feel weak. We tell leaders to be true, open, and ethical. But if the pace system, structure, and flow of information stay the same, behavior will follow the structure, not the words. I've seen leaders sincerely try to change culture while keeping ranking systems that forced a number of employees into low performance. The words changed, but the system didn't. Within a year, competition intensified again and anxiety resurfaced. The system absorbed the change and went back to what it was. True Machiavellian intelligence knows this. It's not about manipulating emotions one conversation at a time. It's about building an environment where desired actions are the easiest path. And here, the tension peaks. When control is built into the system, it's harder to find responsibility. Employees blame themselves for not adapting. Citizens blame each other for division. Users blame their own lack of discipline for screen addiction. Meanwhile, the system operates quietly. If fear can be managed and distance can be created and morality can be justified, then system design completes the circle. The most stable power is the one that doesn't look like power at all. The disturbing question isn't who has authority. It's who designed the rules that make our choices feel inevitable, and whether we would recognize that design if we were living inside it. If the rules are designed well enough, power no longer needs to shout. It simply unfolds. But there's a detail that doesn't fit. Someone still has to be at the center of it, and that center is rarely peaceful. Research on leadership and loneliness has been growing. In 2012, a study found that people in power report higher levels of isolation, not because they lack social contact, but because they lack equal relationships. The higher the rank, the fewer people they can speak freely with. I didn't expect the emotional imbalance to be so significant. Subordinates can complain upward or sideways. Leaders complain downward at their own risk. Julian Holt-Lundstad's analysis showed that loneliness increases mortality risk as much as smoking. We often think of that in terms of older people, but isolation at the top has a different feel. It's not the absence of people, it's the absence of equals. Winning alone creates that structure. Then there's decision fatigue. Roy Baumeister's research suggested that self-control and decision-making use limited mental resources. One study found that judges were more likely to grant parole earlier in the day and after breaks. With less energy, default decisions took over. If that happens in courtrooms, imagine it in executive offices where hundreds of decisions add up daily. A leader who centralizes authority also centralizes mental load. Every choice becomes a vulnerability. Delegating feels risky. Information has to be filtered and interpreted. Staying vigilant becomes routine. Historical examples make this clearer. Joseph Stalin gained power through purges that eliminated rivals. Accounts describe a suspicious inner circle. Associates disappeared. Meetings shrank. Information narrowed. In securing absolute dominance, Stalin reduced his informational variety and decisions became erratic. Paranoia wasn't just his personality, it was reinforced by isolation. Even in less extreme situations, the pattern remains. Corporate leaders who survive power struggles often become more guarded. After an attempted ousting, one chief executive restricted access, relying on a trusted circle. Performance stabilized for a time, but innovation slowed, and employees described the atmosphere as tense. Control narrows the channel of trust. Psychological profiles of high-control personalities show similar things. A need for dominance, dislike of uncertainty, and high sensitivity to threats. Some of these things correlate with success in competition, but they also correlate with stress. High cortisol, sleep problems, and staying alert. The nervous system doesn't easily tell the difference between external threat and internal suspicion. I've spoken with founders who insisted they trusted no one fully. They said it with pride. It sounded like armor. But when asked about succession or rest, the confidence broke. One admitted he checked dashboards at 3 a.m. because things fall apart when you stop watching. The system he designed needed constant monitoring from its creator. From the outside, winning alone looks clean, free, and efficient. From the inside, it often feels like permanent contingency planning. Subordinates feel this too, though differently. When a leader is always vigilant, communication tightens. Jokes disappear and feedback decreases. Employees mirror the anxiety. They double-check emails and avoid risks. A culture of caution spreads from a single point of control. There's also a mental distortion that emerges. Research suggests that power can reduce empathy. As authority rises, the ability to read social cues decreases. If isolation adds to that, the leader not only trusts fewer people, but understands them less. Misunderstandings increase, and suspicion becomes self-reinforcing. I didn't expect how quickly control can become fragility. In some monarchies, rulers created complex rituals to manage closeness. Access was planned, petitioners knelt, and speech was scripted. These systems projected grandeur, but they also insulated rulers from unfiltered information. When crises happened, responses were slow because signals had been weakened. The psychological cost is rarely discussed. Machiavelli warned about hatred and contempt, but not insomnia. Winning alone reduces external dependence, but increases internal pressure. Every alliance becomes a potential threat, every subordinate a variable, and every silence ambiguous. At some point, the system of control starts to resemble a cage, not because others imprison the leader, but because the leader can't afford to loosen the design. The question that arises is uncomfortable. If absolute freedom requires absolute vigilance, and vigilance erodes clarity, is solitary victory truly stability, or a prolonged state of defensive tension waiting for a blind spot to appear? If solitary victory risks becoming a cage, we're left with a final task: mapping the mechanism completely, not to glorify it, but to see it without illusion. Strip away the drama, and what remains is a loop. It starts with reducing dependence. Machiavelli's distrust of mercenaries, founders wary of investors, or executives breaking up power after coups show that pattern. The fewer actors you rely on, the fewer points of leverage exist against you. You minimize exposure to being betrayed and reduce the number of people whose choices can destabilize you. Reducing dependence creates instability in others, and that's where the second move comes in: control uncertainty. Neuroscience shows that unpredictable threats increase attention and compliance. Leaders who manage ambiguity through transparency, shifting incentives, or crisis framing shape behavior without constant conflict. The rally around the flag after emergencies and the productivity under opaque systems are responses to managed anxiety. Once uncertainty is activated, perception has to be managed. Distance is introduced and access becomes limited. Research shows perceived hierarchy grows when boundaries are clear. Leaders manage appearances, and executives filter communication through formal channels. Even professionals manage availability, delaying responses to increase worth. Limiting status amplifies value. But distance alone raises suspicion, so it has to be morally justified. And that's the fourth move: rationalize necessary harm. Cognitive dissonance theory explains how self-image fits action. Licensing shows how past ethics can authorize later actions. When layoffs are framed as saving the company, when surveillance is justified as safety, and when algorithms are defended as optimization, actors rarely feel corrupt. They feel responsible. The engine converts contradiction into coherence. Then comes the structural shift: design the system. Incentives replace command. Earnings targets shift behavior without an order. Social media rewards outrage without ideological directives. Procedures distribute authority. The system channels action, and people comply because the easiest path has been redesigned. Finally, isolation becomes a feature, not a side effect. The designer stands apart, buffered by layers. Research suggests that as authority increases, sensitivity can decline. Loneliness studies show that leaders trust fewer people. Vigilance is constant, and the loop closes. Reduced dependence leads to engineered distance. reinforcing freedom and control. What emerges isn't a caricature of a tyrant, but a system of reduction. Winning alone is less about cruelty and more about removing unpredictable elements, fewer dependencies, fewer surprises, and fewer dissenters. I didn't expect how clear the model would look when assembled. It feels mechanical, and it's not limited to palaces. In platforms, founders reduced dependence on media by building direct systems. They controlled uncertainty through algorithm updates, managed perception, and justified data usage as necessary for innovation. They designed systems where users adapted to logic. Opposition fragmented. On a smaller scale, individuals copy this loop in their careers. A consultant builds a brand to reduce dependence on an employer. They delay availability and frame negotiation as necessity. Over time, they operate alone. From the outside, this looks like freedom, but here the conflict sharpens. Freedom from dependence often requires controlling others, and that limits those freedoms. The designer, in maintaining the system, becomes bound to it. Fatigue, vigilance, and distance add up. So who is really free? The subordinate feels constrained by system. The leader feels constrained by the need to maintain balance. The user scrolling thinks they are choosing, and the algorithm adjusts behind the scenes. The ultimate victory isn't defeating rivals in conflict. It's building conditions where rivals never coordinate, where alternatives seem irrational, and where opposition disappears before it solidifies. No execution, just a world arranged so that resistance feels impractical. And if that's the highest form of control, a system where opposition never forms, the most unsettling question isn't whether such power exists. It's whether we would recognize it while participating in it.